Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and today we're continuing our Fall of the Han lore series with episode 3 titled The Side Effects Kick In. So we ended our last episode in the year 159 when Emperor Liu Zhi finally stood up to the Liang clan headed by the Grand Commandant Liang Ji, who held the real power throughout the empire. With the help of his 5 eunuchs, Emperor Liu Zhi finally truly ascended to the throne. And it only made sense that these 5 eunuchs were rewarded for their loyalty, as they were all made into dukes. Now, since eunuchs can't have children to pass on their title, their family members instead were rewarded with government positions and minor titles. Shan Chao was also made into a general to take control of the armies that used to be under Liang Ji. But at the same time, disposing Liang Ji in such a swift manner did have some side effects. First and foremost, with the eviction of all the court officials who used to be associated with Liang Ji, left the government in a very empty state. Well, a lot of scholars who also had a tough time under Liang Ji's rule thought that it was their time to shine. Emperor Liu Zhi had other thoughts, as he didn't trust scholars. In his eyes, scholars were largely useless. They either cowered under Liang Ji's rule or became martyrs themselves. And since most scholars come from powerful clans who could afford to educate their children, Liu Zhi was also worried that one of these clans would become too powerful. So instead, most of the government positions went to his eunuchs and their families. Now, in stark contrast, eunuchs and their families were the exact opposite of scholars and their powerful clan families, because only the poorest family would consider selling their kids to the palace to become eunuchs. So they were definitely uneducated and unfit to govern. And many of them, with their newfound powers, soon became just as corrupt as Liang Ji and his followers. But Emperor Liu Zhi was not naive to these offenses, and he did place a few scholars into high government roles to help curb the corruption of his eunuchs. And he even set an example by executing Zuo Guan and exiling Ju Yuan, before completely removing the rank of duke from the other 3 eunuchs as well to set an example. But deep down inside, Emperor Liu Zhi still preferred these corrupt eunuchs to scholars simply because the eunuchs were never going to be a threat to his power. And most of his government remained under the control of the eunuchs, whose corruption ravaged the land until the year 166, when this brooding conflict between the eunuchs and the scholars finally boiled over with the 党锢之祸, or the party incident. Now, this infamous event, often cited during the Three Kingdoms period as the main cause of the decline of the Han dynasty, deserves some of our attention. And to better understand this event, we have to introduce 2 main characters. On the scholar side, we have Li Ying, who was hailed as the scholars' leader. In 165, Li Ying was a district attorney of the capital, responsible for criminal prosecution. And in his younger days, he was a renowned general on the Western Front, responsible for holding back the Qiang nomadic race. Now, you might find it interesting that a lot of generals during this time period were also scholars. For example, we have Lu Zhi in the upcoming Mandate of Heaven DLC, who was both a scholar and a general as well. And the reason for this phenomenon was due to the way social mobility worked in the Han dynasty, where clans played a big role in all aspects of society. There were no merit-based system of moving up the social ladder, and government posts were handed out exclusively based on recommendations. So you had to either come from a well-known family or know someone from a well-known family to gain your position. That's why we have so many characters from this period who are descendants of other famous characters. For example, Cao Cao can trace his line back to Cao Teng, Sun Jian can even trace his line back to Sun Zi, who wrote The Art of War, and Kong Rong can trace his line all the way to Confucius. And even Liang Ji can trace his line to one of the founding generals of the Eastern Han dynasty. But if you're not born into one of these powerful clans, you still had some hope. For example, He Jin, who was an uneducated butcher, who had lost both of his parents at a young age and had to help raise his 5 siblings, eventually rose to power because his younger sister became the new empress. Or, if you had some real talent, you could try to impress someone from a well-known clan to receive a recommendation. For example, our main character Li Ying was hailed as the leader of the scholars at the time, and many wanted to receive praise and recommendation from him. So getting an invite to his home was nicknamed 登龙门, or climbing the dragon's gate, because that was your one chance to impress him, and doing so would land you a recommendation that could jumpstart your whole career in government. As a matter of fact, Xun Yu, who is also going to be receiving a new model in the upcoming Mandate Heaven DLC, had an uncle named Xun Shuang, who ended up impressing Li Ying and was even invited to drive Li Ying's carriage so they could extend their conversation as Li Ying was headed out for other obligations. And even though driving a carriage was seen as a servant's job, Xun Shuang saw it as an honor and would brag about this experience for the rest of his life. So just from these stories, we can see just how influential Li Ying was during this time period, as he was also ranked as head of the 8 talents, which was the scholar version of Mount Rushmore at the time. And for students in the Royal Academy, Li Ying was hailed as the role model for what a scholar should become. Opposite of Li Ying and our other main character here in this conflict was Zhang Rang, who was the head of the eunuchs during this time period. He will eventually become even more famous and influential during the rule of the Emperor Liu Hong, as he will become the head of the infamous 10 eunuchs, and was even nicknamed Godfather by Liu Hong, who saw him as a father figure. And we could find Zhang Rang in the new game, as during the Let's Play, you saw him on the side in the bureaucrat section, as shown here. Now, the conflict between our two main characters of Li Ying and Zhang Rang occurred in the year 165, when Zhang Rang's younger brother was found guilty in a corruption scandal. And since Li Ying was the district attorney of the capital during this time, he was responsible for the arrest, but Zhang Rang's younger brother hid in Zhang Rang's house outside the palace. Well, most officials were scared to offend Zhang Rang. Li Ying didn't care, and barged into Zhang Rang's home and searched with his men and dragged Zhang Rang's little brother out onto the street and threw him into prison, where he was executed soon for his crimes. This act by Li Ying was seen by the scholars at the time as an official declaration of war against the corruption of the eunuchs and their relatives. So very soon, many administrators started to arrest and prosecute relatives of eunuchs in their commanderies as well. And the hatred toward these corrupt eunuchs and their families, who really didn't deserve their position in the eyes of the scholars, were so great that many of the local administrators took the law too far, as they tortured and often killed these relatives of the eunuchs before a full trial was given, because in their mind, the transgressions were so blatantly obvious. And they also worried that if the case was transferred to the capital, then the influences of the eunuchs would help free their relatives. Now, this large wave of anti-eunuch movement swept across the land for the next few months, and the eunuchs in the palace could only beg the emperor to help them out, as they argue that these scholars are taking the law into their own hands. So, the emperor, using the opportunity of the festivities of the New Year holidays in the year 166 to grant a nationwide pardon to all those arrested throughout the land. But at this time, the scholars didn't want to relent, and many, including some famous figures such as Wang Yun, who later used Diaochan to divide Dong Zhuo and Lü Bu, ended up ignoring these imperial pardons, as they straight up murdered all the prisoners related to the eunuchs, while only pardoning and releasing prisoners of other crimes. And we're talking about whole families that included hundreds of peoples. And the scholars justify this by claiming that they are ridding the land of evil and corruption. But in the emperor's eyes, these so-called scholars are openly defying the imperial decree and taking the law into their own hand. So, in the year 166, a government official who was working for the eunuchs at the time named Zhang Cheng, whose son was killed by Li Ying despite a royal pardon, accused Li Ying of forming a party within the government that threatened the emperor. Now, throughout all of China's dynasties, party formation was strictly banned, as it was viewed as almost like unionization, where now the officials who are supposed to be servants to the land and the emperor are now banding together as a challenger to the throne. Emperor Liu Zhi, who had just seen his royal pardon largely ignored, completely agreed with this accusation and ordered the arrest of over 200 government officials who were associated with Li Ying. And this arrest and the trial that followed was called the Party Incident. However, the mass arrest didn't actually do much, as the two top officials in charge of prosecuting this so-called party crime were both on Li Ying's side, as they refused to proceed with the actual trial and instead pleaded with the emperor on Li Ying's behalf. And the emperor really couldn't actually execute these 200 scholars either, because not only do they represent most of the government, they were also all from powerful clans that the emperor needed to actually run the country. And there were even many scholars who petitioned to be arrested themselves as well, because they felt ashamed to not be considered as an associate of the great Li Ying. And even eunuchs didn't want this trial to actually happen, as there were too much evidence related to how far their relatives have gone in terms of corruption, and they didn't want the emperor to find out. So finally, in December of 166, the emperor's new father-in-law, General Dou, was able to convince the emperor to release all those captured during the party incident. Now, before we close out the party incident, we need to deviate for a little bit and cover why Emperor Liu Zhi is now on his third empress. So the last time we talked about the emperor's love life was when his first empress, Liang Nüying, had just died, and he was able to pick someone he liked in Liang Mengnü to replace her. But as time wore on, the emperor, in his newfound power and freedom, started to overindulge in women, and eventually had over 5,000 concubines and maids. Liu Zhi was also a bit mentally twisted, perhaps, from all his years living as a puppet emperor, as he would host massive orgies with fellow government officials where all 5,000 of his concubines were required to attend. And in these orgies, he would often enjoy watching rather than participating. And eventually, these lewd acts created a divide between him and the empress, and it also didn't help that the empress often reminded him of Liang clan's control. So he eventually exiled her and wanted to pick one of his favorite concubines to become the new empress. But there were many at the court who argued against this, as they wanted the emperor to pick Dou Miao, who had come from a powerful clan, to provide some dignity to the role of empress. So the emperor relented and made Dou Miao his empress, and pretty much ignored her as he continued his orgies with his concubines. So after Dou Miao's father, Dou Wu, successfully pleaded for the release of Li Ying and the scholars, the final result of these arrests are that everyone who was arrested are banned from government and will be placed under house arrest for the rest of their lives. However, this party incident didn't just end here, as within a year, Emperor Liu Zhi would die, probably due to too much partying with his concubines, and despite being super active sexually, he would leave behind only 3 daughters and no sons, leaving the Han Dynasty once again looking for a distant relative to ascend to the throne. So to find out what happens next, come back tomorrow as we'll continue with our Fall of the Han lore series.